It's been 2.5 years since the last Rocket League World Championship, and a lot has happened since then. So today we're going to be going over every single roster from the Season 8 World Championship and every single roster from the World Championship coming up here in August. First one, we're just going to go down Season 8 in order and see what those rosters look like now. So first off, NRG started with Justin, Garrett G, Turbo. They ended up winning in Season 8. In Season 9, they got 3rd or 4th, and so they decided that wasn't good enough, and they replaced Turbo Postal with Squishy. Then they went on for Season X. They won in North America, and they maintained this roster, and they are currently the 3 seed heading into this World Championship. Vitality was the runner-up in Season 8. You have K-Dop, Fairy Peak, and Scrubkilla. Immediately after this, they kicked Scrubkilla out for 54. They ended up getting 2nd in RLCS Season 9 in EU. They stuck with this roster and ended up winning RLCS X, although BDS was the more dominant team in that. They ended up sticking with this roster through the winner of this split, where things inevitably did not go their way, and so they replaced Fairy Peak with Redosin, and they did not end up qualifying for this World Championship. Dignitas was 3rd, 4th in Season 8. They had Violent Panda, Yukio, and Astral. They ended up sticking with this roster and winning in Europe in Season 9, but they decided in the offseason that they needed a bit of a change. Astral went on to a different team, and they picked up Joria's instead. They didn't do so well in RLCS Season X, and after one split, they ended up kicking Yukio for apparently Jack. They run with Violent Panda, apparently Jack, and Jorius for a while until the end of RLCS X, when eventually they get 8th overall in the split. They kick Violent Panda for Scrubkilla, and they maintain this roster through all of this season of RLCS, and they are currently entering as the 4 seed for Europe. Space Station ended up getting 3rd or 4th in the last World Championship as well, but this was with a roster of Sypical, Arsenal, and AXB. They stick with this roster for Season 9, and they end up getting 2nd in North America, but during the offseason, there was a little bit of turmoil, and they end up kicking AXB for Reddles. This team ended up being dominant in the fall major, but they ended up falling off towards the end of the season. But in championships for RLCS X, they end up getting 2nd, and they've stuck with this roster through the fall split, and eventually Sypical was looking for a change of pace, and so they replaced him with Daniel, and Space Station is now running with this roster and are the current North American 5 seed. Veloce was the 5th/6th team in RLCS 8, and they had Flame, Freaky, and Casio. This roster did not go under any changes for Season 9, but after Season 9, they end up kicking Freaky for Archie. This team would eventually become Top Blokes as they are no longer sponsored by Veloce. They end up getting 3rd and 4th in RLCS X for EU. They had a much more surprising run in the championships than many people expected. However, they still determined that they wanted a roster change, so they end up kicking Flame for Chaussette. This roster of Archie, Chaussette, and Casio were picked up by Semper Esports and continued with this roster in the fall and in the winter. However, after winter, Archie ends up leaving and Exotic joins the roster, and they're the current EU 6 seed, just barely scraping by into this World Championship. Pittsburgh Knights were the other team that placed 5th, 6th in the RLCS 8. They had Reddles, Gyro, and Mist. Mist decided that he wanted to play a bit more offense, and so he ended up going to Ghost Gaming. AJ came in to replace him, and they end up getting 7th place in RLCS Season 9. This was not an acceptable result in many of these players' eyes, and so Reddles ends up leaving after a long off-season of turmoil, and Illusion ends up taking his place. They also reformed the Peeps, as they were no longer sponsored by the Pittsburgh Knights. This team did surprisingly well in RLCS X and stuck with this roster up through the winter split, when eventually in the spring split they get picked up by FaZe Clan. They end up getting 6th in the RLCS X NA championships, and they decide this isn't good enough, and they are able to pick up First Killer, which is a fantastic acquisition for this team. They stick with this roster through the fall split, but eventually Illusion is on his way out as well, and Sypical gets picked up. And so the roster is Sypical, First Killer, and AJ is currently representing FaZe Clan, and they are the NA number 2 seed heading into this World Championship. Reciprocity was 7th through 8th at this World Championship. That was the roster of Fruity, Farah, and Chaussette. This is a long-standing European roster that ends up sticking together again, but they only get 5th in RLCS 9. And when Astral is an available pickup, they have to take him, so Fruity gets kicked. It's Astral, Farah, and Chaussette for the RLCS Season X. They have a bit of a slow start, but maintain this roster as under the Oxygen banner. Eventually they get picked up by Solari, and they end up getting 6th in RLCS X championships for Europe. However, after that, this team disbanded as Chaussette went to Semper and Astral went to his other team. Farah ended up retiring. Renegades was the other 7th through 8th team. This was Torsos, Cammy, and Siki. Quite after that tragic own goal, eventually Torsos was out, and CJ comes in, and he is the main face of the Renegades organization, I'd argue, currently, as he's honestly the main face of most of OCE. They stick with this roster and end up getting 5th in OCE in RLCS Season 9, which was very shocking. They had a terrible start to the season, and in the infamous Team Esper throw, ends up keeping them out of the playoffs for that season. However, they determined their team is good enough to keep going, and they stick with this roster all the way through the winter split of RLCS Season X, when eventually they decide they need a change, and they pick up the young mechanical gun Fever for Seki. They go on a tear in spring split, but they aren't quite able to make championships, but they've stuck with this roster through this entire season, and they're currently the OCE #1 seed heading into this World Championship. E United came in 9th through 12th at the last World Championship. This was a roster of Ajax, Roldes, and Hoxer. They made a couple questionable roster changes, but not for Season 9. They end up getting 9th, barely scraped by out of the relegation tournaments. But they end up kicking Roldes for memory. Roldes ends up retiring temporarily after this. This roster change only lasted for that offseason, as eventually Wanda Mike was used to replace Memory, which was very surprising as they had decent offseason results with Memory. This roster did fall flat rather quickly, however, as eventually Hoxer got replaced for Tristan in another confusing roster change. They stuck with this roster for quite a while, and eventually Wanda Mike was on his way out for Dapper, and at this point it was just all falling apart for E United. They ended up picking up Savvy for the fall split of this season, and they've stuck with this roster for a bit. Eventually Money came in to replace Tristan, and if you're not recognizing any of these names at this point, I cannot fault you because they have not had good results for a while. They did not make this World Championship. Low Key Esports was the roster of Card, Kaio, and Tander in the Season 9 World Championship. They stuck with this roster for Season 9 in South America. I don't believe this was the logo, but they did fly under the banner of Novus AE. They stuck with this roster and eventually got picked up by 11s, and they win Season 9. They were under the 11s banner until winter, when eventually they go back to Novus AE, and they get picked up by Furia in the spring of RLCS X. They stuck with this roster through the entirety of RLCS X and ended up 2nd in South America, only falling to True Neutral in the finals. However, this was not good enough for them. They wanted new talent on the board, so they pick up Jan in place of Tander, and they've been going on an absolute tear of South America, and they end up being the 1 seed heading into this World Championship from South America. The Three Sins was the other South American team represented at the RLCS 8 World Championship. This had the roster of Maddox, Math, and Vault. Immediately afterwards, they replaced Math with PJ, and that's kind of a mistake because if you're not Furia or that roster, you're not going to make land unless you have Math on your team. They end up getting 4th in Season 9, and quite after this, they disband. The other OCE team in RLCS 8 was Canberra Havoc. This had Leduc, Walcott, and Spidoge. No one expected them to make it, and immediately afterwards, they kicked Spidoge for Tango. They stuck with this roster, but end up getting 8th in OCE Season 9 and disband right after that. They've reformed a couple times since then, but they are not anywhere near qualifying for the World Championship. Here are the North American teams heading in to Worlds 2022. The 1 seed from North America is G2 with JNAPS, Chicago, and Atomic. Now, where were they back in Season 8? Well, they did not have a good split. They ended up getting last in North America, escape out of the relegation tournament. They had the roster of JNAPS, Chicago, and Rizzo. They stuck with that roster when many people were calling for a roster change, as it is G2, one of the more popular teams, and when the results aren't there, people want changes. However, they stick with the roster, end up winning Season 9, and they head into this winter of RLCS X with this roster when eventually Rizzo retires. He's replaced by the substitute Drees, who was a fantastic performance, and eventually G2 ends up getting 3rd, 4th in RLCS X for NA. They stick with this roster through the fall split when eventually they decide to look for an upgrade, and Drees gets the boot in place of Atomic. Since then, G2 has had 1 misstep in the very first event, but they have been dominant ever since, winning several events, including the Winter Major, and they are the 1 seed for NA heading into this event. FaZe Clan, as I explained earlier, is the 2 seed for North America. Same with NRG is the 3 seed. The 4 seed we have not seen at the Season 8 World Championship, and this was the roster of Calm, Beast Mode, and Torment. Now, where did this roster start? You actually have to go back to Cloud9 in 2019. They came in 7th for North America in RLCS 8. Another roster that everyone could have seen a move coming. However, they stuck with the same roster, and they did not have as much success in the next season as G2 did. They ended up getting 6th for North America, and eventually Squishy leaves for greener pastures and they run under the enterprise of Rat Enterprises. They trialed several different players here, including Wanda Mike, Com, Reddles, but eventually they end up settling on AXB, and they get picked up by the new organization, Version 1. They stick with this roster for the fall of RLCS X, when eventually AXB gets kicked due to playstyle issues for Com, and then Com stays on this roster, and they eventually get 8th in North America for the season. They stick with this roster for the fall of RLCS 22. However, after this, Gimmick gets kicked for Beast Mode, and the roster of Beast Mode, Com, and Torment are currently the 4th seed for North America. Space Station Gaming, as I mentioned earlier, are the North American 5 seed heading into this World Championship. And the NA 6 seed is actually Optic Gaming. Now, this one you have to go back a little while as well. You have Mist, Illusion, and Drees with the substitute of Turbo Pulsar, but how'd you get there? Well, you started as Ghost Gaming in Season 8, just barely missing out on the World Championship with Memory, Illusion, and Atomic. Now, after this, Memory ends up getting kicked for Mist, and this was the more offense that Mist was looking for. He ends up getting 3rd and 4th in RLCS Season 9, which would have been the first World Championship that Ghost qualified for in quite a long time. They had a history of getting 5th. However, during the offseason, they end up kicking Illusion for Turbo Pulsar, as it's hard to pass up on the 4-time GOAT at this point in time. And they also get picked up by the organization of Envy, as Ghost Gaming goes under for a little bit due to financial troubles in the pandemic. And so they run under the Team Envy banner and end up getting 3rd, 4th in RLCS X as well. They stick with this roster through the fall, but after the first LAN, they end up losing Atomic. They have a one-on-one trade with G2 and end up picking up Drees. This roster did not do as well, so they stick with this in the winter. But eventually in the spring, Illusion, who had came over to coach, ends up giving Turbo Pulsar the boot, saying, hey, let me do this myself. So he ends up back on his own team. They get picked up by Optic as the Envy Optic merger finally comes to Rocket League, and they are the 6th seed for North America. European teams heading to the World Championship in 2022. The number 1 seed is Moist Esports, the organization run by Charlie. This has Vatira, Rise, and Joyo. This team does not go as far back as many of the others we've seen. They only go to the preseason of RLCS 2021-2022. They stick with this roster at the same time, and that is the logo of the team name Magnolia. They were quickly picked up by Team Queso, got 9th in the fall split, ended up dominating in the winter split, getting the 1 seed for Europe and getting 2nd in the winter major. And in the spring, they were picked up by Moist Esports, and they end up winning the spring major and are currently the EU 1 seed. The EU 2 seed is Team BDS. This team does go back to Season 8, but they weren't in RLCS. In Season 8, they were in RLCS, and they got 5th, which was enough to stay in the league, but it was not enough to promote them. So they stay in RLCS for Season 9 with the roster of Monkey Moon, Mark by 8, ClayX. They stick together, they get picked up by Team BDS, and they get 1st in RLCS in RLCS Season 9. Ends up automatically promoting in what was thought to be RLCS Season 10. However, due to bad results in the spring series, they end up kicking ClayX for Extra, and the roster of Monkey Moon, Mark by 8, and Extra end up going on an absolute tear in Season X, being the most dominant team we've seen for a very long time. There were many arguments regarding whether they were more dominant than Dignitas. However, they could not close it out and end up getting 2nd in the season, losing in the championships to Vitality. They stuck with this roster through the winter major when they end up getting perfect swept by FaZe on LAN, and it's decided a change is needed. Mark by 8 gets kicked by the new mechanical young gun Seku, and they end up heading into the World Championship as a 2nd seed after an absolutely dismal performance at the spring major. The EU 3 seed is Endpoint, and this roster also goes back a long time into the EU RLRS. This one currently is Metzenaris, Relating Wave, and Archie, but that will change as only Relating Wave is the remaining member. The Discombobulators got 3rd in RLRS for Season 8 with Nachitao, Relating Wave, and Virtuoso. And they got quickly picked up by Endpoint, and they go into RLCS Season 9. They end up getting 8th. However, after this, they decided a change was needed. They kicked Nachitao for Metzenaris, and they go on an absolute tear. Virtuoso was known for his demos, and they had some decent results in RLCS X, but end up getting 10th in Europe for this. They eventually kick Virtuoso after the long season and replace him with Seku in a move that nobody saw as a positive upgrade because nobody knew who Seiko was. However, they went on a tear in fall split, getting 2 regional wins for Europe, and they stuck with this roster through winter until eventually Seku got picked up by Team BDS. Now, to replace him, Archie came in, which was probably the best move Endpoint could have made at that point, and they still have decent results and are currently the 3 seed for Europe heading into the World Championship. The Dignitas roster, as I mentioned, currently Scrubkilla, apparently Jack and Joyous, are the 4 seed. Carmine Corps is the 5th seed coming out of Europe. They have Astral, Itachi, and Nali. However, this roster goes way back to the days of RCD Espanol. Back in RLCS 9, they ended up playing in the RLRS and got second. They just barely lost in the relegation tournament. This was a roster of Zamway, Tox, and Stake, and so they could not make a theoretical RLCS Season 10 run. However, due to the new format and getting picked up by Giants, a lot of people were very excited to see what this roster could do. They ended up having some good results. However, due to toxicity issues, they end up kicking Tox for Itachi, and they run with this roster through the rest of RLCS Season X, and they just barely miss out on championships due to a bit of a downturn in the later half of the season. Due to this, Zamway ends up getting kicked, and the team picks up Astral, and at this point, they also get picked up by Carmine Corps. They stick with this roster through the fall split. They just barely miss out on the major, as well as in the winter. They also missed out on the winter major, and so after this, a change definitely needed to be had. They end up kicking Stake for Nali, and they qualify for the spring major, end up getting 4th in that, and they are the current EU 5 seed heading into this event. Semper Esports, as I mentioned, is the current EU 6 seed heading into the World Championship. The OCE teams going to Worlds in 2022. The 1st seed, as I mentioned earlier, is Renegades. The 2nd seed is KC Pioneers with Super Locky, Banana Head, and Scrub. This is a team that nobody saw coming until this season, as they started out under the roster of Forkitten. They stuck with the same roster and eventually got picked up by Pioneers in the winter. They made the winter and the spring majors and had some surprising results there. They end up going top 12 in the winter major, but only due to the inability for Sandrock Gaming to come and play. However, in the spring major, they pulled off a massive upset against Team BDS and got themselves 9th through 12th again, and end up qualifying for the World Championship based on that win. They're currently the 2 seed for OCE. South American teams going to the World Championship include Furia as the 1 seed. The 2 seed is Team Secret under the roster of Sad, Knight, and Math. They started out this season in the fall. They were Sad, Knight, and Drufino. After the fall, they got picked up by Noble, but then Noble got, exposed for being kind of a shady org. Eventually, in the winter, they kick Drufino for Math, and they fly under the banner of Erased, eventually until Team Secret picks them up for the winter major. They stick with this roster. They make the spring major as well, and they're currently the 2 seed for South America heading into the World Championship. The 3 seed for the World Championship is currently flying under the roster of the club. They may have been picked up by an organization by the time the World Championship starts, but it is the roster of Astromic, Lost, and KV1. This roster started back in RLCS X Winter under Locusts, and it was Astromic, Snips, and Yan. Now, they stick with this roster through the spring. They get picked up by Rebel, and eventually Yan leaves for Furia after the RLCS X season, and they pick up Math instead. Now, considering Math has been to every land since Season 8, he managed to qualify for the fall major with Era Eternity, as this roster is now flying under. But he ends up leaving, and they replace him with KV1. They don't end up making the winter or spring majors, and after not making the winter major, they end up replacing Snips with Lost, and so they're currently known as the club, flying with a roster of Astromic, Lost, and KV1, and they're currently the SAM 3 seed. There's been several new regions added since the last World Championship, including MENA, APAC North, APAC South, and SSA. MENA, Middle East and North Africa, is where the famous Sandrock Gaming, or now known as Team Falcons, currently hail out of. They are the 1 seed coming out of that region, running under the roster of Khaled, Ahmad, and TRK. This roster started way back, but the first result that you may know them of is from the European Invitational that Johnny Boy ran, and they ran under the roster of Khaled, Ahmad, and Senza. This was back when they were on Sandrock Gaming, and the only real Middle Eastern team that people actually knew about. They were ineligible for RLCS X, and at that point, Senzo ended up retiring due to lack of motivation, as there was nothing really to play for Middle Eastern players. And to replace him, Sandrock Gaming ends up getting TRK, and they run with this roster until eventually Middle East is allowed to play in the RLCS X. They play under this roster for the fall, have decent results at the fall major, end up upsetting G2. However, for the fall major, Khaled could not make it due to exams, and so Senzo replaced him. So they end up getting 5th through 8 with not even their full roster. For the winter major, they could not end up making it due to visa issues, so they had to stay at home. They got 13th through 16th automatically. The Sandrock organization ends up kind of falling apart. They get picked up by Team Falcons, and they run under the roster of Team Falcons banner until they end up getting 2nd in the spring major. And now they are the MENA 1 seed with over 4,000 points gathered through this season and 9 regional wins. The 2 seed from Middle East North Africa is under the banner of Veloce Esports, actually. They're running with a roster of SMW, Twiz, and Senzo. Senzo has unretired since now he is able to compete at the highest level. He also played at the fall major, as I mentioned previously. But they actually started out as Team Falcons in the fall of this season with SMW, Twiz, and Ali. They stuck with this. Actually, they did not stick with this roster. They picked up Venom for the winter major, and they stuck with this roster just for one split as Senzo became available, was no longer subbing for Sandrock Gaming, and they also get picked up by Veloce at this time, and they are currently the 2 seed for Middle East North Africa heading into this World Championship. O1 Esports is the MENA 3 seed heading into this event. It's Zonix, AMS, and M7SN. I don't know how to pronounce that. I apologize. They started out this season as the Ultimates. In the fall, they stuck under this banner through the winter, and in the spring, they had a bit of a faulty split, but ended up qualifying. They're currently the Middle East 3 seed. Tokyo Verde is the representative coming out of APAC North. This is the roster of Realize, Tenhao, and Sigums. And this was a roster that competed at the fall major with Realize, Tenhao, and Maru. However, after the fall major, they end up kicking Maru for Conra. They stick with this roster through the winter major, but results don't end up going their way, and they don't qualify for the winter major. And so they kick Conra for Sigums. They've stuck with this roster through the spring and are now the APAC North representative, as there's only one team from APAC North going to this World Championship. The APAC South representative, there's also only one team, is the Gammon Gladiators, and this is a team with LCT, Maxu, and Abs Crazy. They started this season with a roster of LCT, Maxu, and Balearis under the roster of Alka. They stuck with this organization through most of the fall when eventually they get picked up by Pulse Clan. However, Pulse Clan is unable to fund their roster for very long, so they end up reverting back to the 3 rats, and they end up kicking Balearis for Chaotic for the winter split. They don't qualify for either the fall or the winter majors. They get picked up by Gammon Gladiators in the winter, but they kick Chaotic for Abs Crazy. They end up qualifying for the spring major with Abs Crazy, and they were fairly dominant in APAC South through the season, so they are the representative for them heading into this World Championship. The Sub-Saharan Africa region is another new region. They haven't participated at any of the majors, and so these teams might be fairly unfamiliar. The number 1 seed coming out of SSA is the Orlando Pirates. This is the roster of Snowy, Skillsteel, and Darth. The 2 seed from SSA is the roster of Bravado Gaming. It's Daisy, Happy Meal, and To Die For. This roster started out as Water in the fall. They were under the roster of Cam, Happy Meal, and To Die For. Eventually, Cam gets kicked for Daisy, and this happened in the fall, actually, and they stuck with this roster and Bravado Gaming through the rest of the season and are the 2 seed for SSA. Now, if you watch some of the majors throughout the season, you may notice that some of the teams that made the majors aren't going to the World Championship. These are those teams. In the fall major, Complexity made it. This was a team that transferred from South America to North America over the seasons. HAG, Razebull, and Shad originally started out on the roster True Neutral. They won South America for RLCS X and decided they were going to go where they could improve more. They've already conquered South America. It's time to conquer North America. They end up getting picked up by Complexity. They participate in the fall major under this roster. However, the results don't quite go their way, and due to North America not getting enough region spots, Complexity at 7th does not end up qualifying for the World Championship. Vitality, as I mentioned, they went to the fall major. They did not make this World Championship. A team that participated at the fall major was Amphis, Express, and Torsas. They flew under the banner of Ground Zero. Now, this team goes way back to when it was Deca, Requiem, and Jules. Now, Deca and Requiem have been banned from competing for quite a long time, and we will likely never see them again. This team got 4th in OCE for RLCS 8. They end up kicking Requiem for Express. They stay under the banner of Ground Zero, and they end up winning in RLCS 9 for OCE. However, these results weren't good enough over the offseason, and they end up kicking Deca for Amphis. Now, the roster of Amphis, Express, and Jules lasted for approximately 1 split. They stuck together for the fall when eventually a trade went through with Cringe Society, and Torsas gets moved to this roster. And so the roster of Amphis, Express, and Torsas end up winning RLCS X as they become absolutely dominant. Amphis becomes the best player in OCE by a large margin, and they win the season. However, this roster did attend the fall major. In the winter major, they did not quite end up qualifying as Renegades of Pioneers went then. They ended up getting picked up by the Organization of Power in the spring, and they qualify for the spring major. However, they could not bring home a win. Therefore, they end up being the 3rd seed from OCE, and due to OCE not getting more than 2 spots at this World Championship, they just barely missed the cut. Evil Geniuses went to the winter major with a roster of Catalysm, Ivan, and Rizex. Now, this roster started out in the spring of RLCS X as German Amigos. They had an absolute tear on some bubble tournaments in the offseason, and they end up getting picked up by Evil Geniuses in the fall. They just barely miss out on the fall major. They attend the winter major, and they cannot make the results stick, and they end up getting 7th for Europe and miss out on the World Championship by 1 spot. Detonator was a team that played in the winter major as well. This was a roster of Olpix, Burn, and Mikan coming out of APAC North. They played with this roster for the fall of the split, and they attended the winter major with this roster. However, after the winter major, they end up kicking Olpix for Lunatic. However, due to not qualifying for the spring major, they could not make it, and they end up getting 2nd in APAC this season. Team Liquid is a team that could go way back if I wanted to. However, due to following the 2/3 rule, we're only going to go back so far. This is a team that attended the spring major after some fantastic results this split, and they actually started as a roster last split. Team Liquid roster included players like Ronicky, Cookseer, Speed, Fruity, and it's been a whole mess of not qualifying and not having the results to back it up. However, they eventually went with a strategy of drafting 2 young mechanical players with potential, building that roster up, and it ended up paying off in the spring split, and I assume it will pay off again next split, as they had fantastic results, not only during the spring split, but they ended up getting 8th or 7th at the spring major, and so only good future for the Team Liquid roster, but they could not get enough points under their belt using only 1 split. They ended up getting 11th for the season. So that's it. Those are the rosters that will be attending this World Championship. Hopefully you are all